I wanted to update you on our fourth year of the corn silage nitrogen response trial. I'm actually going to go back through all of the project at this point from the first 4 years of the project. I'm not convinced that we will continue the project actually after this year. I think we've learned enough at this point to have a very rigorous set of data to update our nitrogen application recommendations for corn silage. So I'm convinced, I guess, at this point that we probably have sufficient data. I'd like to begin by thanking the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. They've been very generous in supporting this much needed research. So I appreciate that very much, and specifically John McClurkin at the Tennessee Department of Agriculture for helping make sure this study was well funded. I had a lot of help. This was a very labor-intensive project, so I'd like to take just a minute to thank Hannah McClellan, my research associate, who's now actually employed with NRCS in Hickman County, Wesley Wright, the station directors, Kevin at MTRAC, Rob at Highland Rim, Dr. Simpson and ETRAC, Walt at Plateau, and then of course the research, the associates that provided so much help for this labor-intensive project at each station, especially Tate Walker and Eddie Pryor and Joe David Plunk at MTRAC and Brad Fisher and Derek Corbin. They're at Highland Rim and Plateau. So with that, I'll get started. I'm going to begin with just a review of the first 3 years of the study and why we conducted it. You know, as you all know, I've talked about this a number of times. We have a disparity between UT Extension's nitrogen recommendations for corn grain and corn silage. We have 5 tiers of nitrogen recommendations for corn grain. They vary depending on the yield expectations in bushels per acre, from 120 to 240 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And if we take the number of bushels per acre we're expecting and divide it by the number of pounds of nitrogen we're recommending, we get what we expect, which is that our nitrogen recommendation per bushel of corn grain is slightly higher than 1. If we look at our current silage recommendations, they're in some cases below 1. So that was one of the reasons that we conducted this study. Is
Hey, Sean, can you get a little bit closer to your mic? We're having trouble hearing you now.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
A little bit better. I don't know what changed. We could hear you fine, and then you started getting really faint.
Okay, hopefully that's not my internet connection going down. At any rate, the major... Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The major point of the study is to update these recommendations and to see whether or not we can justify making them align with our current grain recommendations. These recommendations have not been updated, so far as I can tell, since 1995. We know that corn silage yields have increased since that time. And one of the things that we wanted to focus on in the study was whether or not our nitrogen application rates not only affected the yield, but also the silage quality. One of the important factors that we've looked at are crop removal rates for phosphorus and potassium, and the removal rates for phosphorus in particular are very important. They set the basis for manure application rates, and specifically I've got listed here several different phosphorus and potassium recommendations in terms of the removal rate for corn silage, and you can see that there is a fair bit of variability. But the one that we have to stick with is MMP. For large areas, the majority of nutrient management plans are prepared with the assumption that 3.6 pounds of P2O5 are removed per acre of corn silage harvested. So we wanted to verify whether or not that number was accurate with the study. In the first 3 years of the study, we focused in part on just commercial fertilizer nitrogen application rate recommendations. And the reason we did that is because there's no ambiguity in how much of the nitrogen is available. We know that all of the nitrogen that we apply should be available. And with manure, the availability does vary from year to year. I've got photographs here of the treatments that we used in the small plot studies. We used a control with no nitrogen applied. And then we had varying rates of 120, 150, 180, 210, 240, and 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The intent there was just to simply cover the range of nitrogen recommendations for corn grain, and then to also investigate a relatively high rate where we did expect perhaps we would depress yield. So this is a graph, an aggregate graph of all of the results for all of the stations for the first 3 years of the project. This shows the yield averages for 4 different experiment stations and 3 replicates for each of these nitrogen application rate treatments at each of those stations for each of those years. So this is a lot of data that's used to compose this graph. Over on the left, you can see the y-axis is yield, and it varies from 15 to 30 tons per acre. This is all normalized to 65% moisture. And you can see I've annotated here our current silage recommendations based on the anticipated yield, 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre if your yield is below 18 tons an acre, 150 pounds of nitrogen if your yield is between 18 or 19 and 25 tons an acre. And then anything above 25 tons an acre, we recommend 180. So I've plotted all of the data for this study against our current recommendations. Obviously on the y-axis here, we have the different treatments that we employed, excluding the 300-pound rate, which we know is unreasonable. The fit through these points is what's critical here. And the slope of the line through the points is critical. And in red, this is what I've annotated here. The slope of this line, what we're looking for is for the slope of this line to be different than 0. And in fact, it's not. It does tend to be greater than 0, but it's not significantly different than 0. So what this tells us is that our increase in yield for that extra investment of nitrogen beyond our current maximum of 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre is very modest, perhaps on the order of 3/4 of a ton per acre in any given year. And in some years, obviously, there's not going to be any yield increase with the extra investment in the additional nitrogen. So a modest increase in yield at best. For silage quality, the thing that has really stood out in our study is that the major thing that's affected by our nitrogen application rates are the crude protein content of the corn silage. And similar to the last graph for yield, I have the crude protein plotted as a percent of dry matter against our nitrogen application rates, 120, 150, 180, 210, and 240 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And you can see that in this case, when we fit these points with the line, the slope of the line is significantly different than 0. It is positive. It's 0.2 to 0.5% of an increase in crude protein content per 30-pound nitrogen per acre increase in our nitrogen application rate. So this is one of the reasons that we wanted to consider not just the yield, but also the silage quality, because we know that as we increase our nitrogen application rates, we're also tending to affect silage quality. And this clearly shows that. Now, when we combine the slight tendency for there to be a yield increase with the significant increase in crude protein content, and we consider the crude protein yield in terms of the pound crude protein per acre, that this is a I think, for us to think about in terms of what we get for our investment. And that is that when we when we fit our yield average across all 3 years, all 4 stations, all replicates, what we see is that we have a median value of about 80 pounds of extra crude protein per 30 pound increase in our nitrogen. What we would justify an increase in our application. Okay, can you still hear?
We could hear you, Sean. It definitely sounds like you're lagging a little bit. Don't know if it's our internet or yours.
Okay, but so far everything's been fine.
Yes, so far everything's been great.
Okay. All right, so moving on, obviously, one of the other factors that I mentioned earlier was the phosphorus and potassium removal rates, with the special emphasis on phosphorus because it's used to set our manure application rates. In 2020, we did publish the first 3 years of the study. I've got a picture of the cover of that publication here. And in it, we have a new recommendation for what you should be using for the estimate of your corn silage phosphorus content for your expected yield. And that is 4.3 pounds of P2O5 per ton. At each site, and that's shown with the stations, and for each year, every year that we conducted this study, our corn silage phosphorus concentrations were higher than our reference value that is used to set manure application rates in our nutrient management plants, or most of the nutrient management plants. So far as I can tell, somewhere around a half a pound of P2O5 per ton higher than what our reference value is. So this is something that's important to know. And we published that in a peer-reviewed publication, and we anticipate that MMP will be changed to reflect that. Same is true for potassium. Obviously, it's not as important in terms of setting manure application rates, but it is important for nutrient management planning. And the new rate that we're recommending is 9.8 pounds of potash per ton, and that's at 65% moisture. So the take-home messages for the first 3 years of the study: the N rates above 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre give an inconsistent 3/4 ton yield increase per 30 pounds of nitrogen above 180 pounds of nitrogen. So around 1.5 tons if you increase the nitrogen application rate from 180 to 240 pounds of nitrogen per acre. It's a very modest increase, obviously. There is a consistent increase in crude protein, 0.35% per 30 pounds of nitrogen that you increase your nitrogen application rate. And when we think of that in terms of the yield of crude protein, it's somewhere around 80 pounds of crude protein per acre for that extra 30 pounds of nitrogen. There is a cost. I didn't show this data here, but we did discuss it last year. There is some observed luxury uptake of some of these minerals, including sulfur notably, but also copper and zinc. And that might be something that would be of concern long-term if we produce sulfur deficiencies, for example. And that's one reason that we want to make sure that we're targeting manure to these corn silage fields, because of course, when we remove the entire plant, we're removing a very large quantity of mineral nutrients, as well as nitrogen. So the new corn silage phosphorus and potassium rates are published at this point. You should know that they are variable. That's one take-home message clearly from the study, is that the removal rates for these nutrients are very large, somewhere around 100 to 150 pounds of P2O5 per acre, and anywhere between 200 and 300 pounds of potash per acre. And those values do tend to increase as we increase our nitrogen application rate. So those removal rates are high, and we need to make sure that we're testing these corn silage fields frequently, and I would advocate that we test them annually. One of the other things that we did in the last 3 years of the project to make the work more relevant and useful is to experiment with using manure in combination with commercial fertilizers, and in some cases using manure alone to produce corn silage. And I want to go back and revisit what I felt like in thinking about it was our best result, and that was the result from 2019, where we did a study comparing the corn silage yield and quality if we used a combination of commercial fertilizer and manure, or if we used just manure alone. At planting, we had 2 treatments. The first was 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre as urea with agritane, and the next was 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre only as solid manure. And then we augmented that with irrigation. Of course, you all are aware, we have a center pivot at Little River, and we do irrigate dairy wastewater with the pivot, and that's a very convenient method for us to apply manure nutrients, and it allows us to more or less spoon feed a crop like corn silage, which is obviously the nitrogen demand increases over time. So we augmented those 2 treatments at planting with liquid manure applications, and in total that was about 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So we had 2 scenarios where we had a combination of, one would be commercial fertilizer and liquid manure, and the other would be solid manure and liquid manure fertilizer. The total application rate was approximately 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. This is a plot layout of that study. I don't want to focus on I know the plot layout is busy. I just want you to realize that another part of the study was to examine seeding rates. And we examined these 4 seeding rates based on conversations that I had with a number of you all, just to see whether or not we had yield or silage quality impacts across those seeding rates for these 2 different treatments. What I want to emphasize, and this is important data here, we collected ear leaves from each of these different treatments, and you'll see along the bottom here, we have the seeding rate, which varies from 26,000 up to 32,000 seeds per acre. And we have our 2 treatments, either urea with liquid manure or manure only, the combination of solid and liquid. And you can see there's no letter designations above any of these columns here, and that means there's no statistical difference between any of these results here. So the ear leaf nitrogen content didn't vary whether or not we used some commercial fertilizer or whether we used manure only. And in all cases, the total concentration of nitrogen in the ear leaves was either sufficient or even in some cases in the high range. Again, emphasizing that it's possible for us to use only manure to provide sufficient nitrogen to produce corn silage. This is a plot of the yield. Our yields were excellent, obviously, at or above 26 tons per acre. I think the average was 27, maybe. You can see again, there's no designations with letters, which indicates that all of these treatments are provided similar yields, regardless of the seeding rate, which is shown at the bottom, or whether urea and manure was used, or whether only manure was used to produce the crop. And again, the same was true with crude protein. There was no difference between any of the treatments and any of the seeding rates in terms of the crude protein content of the silage that was harvested. So the take-home message, obviously, be judicious with your seeding rate. I know that we have some producers that are perhaps using seeding rates even higher than what we tested, but we can't seem to replicate any benefit in using higher seeding rates. So that would be one thing to consider. Obviously, we did show that you can produce good yields and high silage quality using only manure. We had similar results in 2018 and similar results in 2020, which I'll show shortly. Our estimate that we used to arrive at our nitrogen application rates for the manure was that 35% of the total nitrogen is plant available. And that is what is published in our recommendations for using dairy manure as a fertilizer, and it turned out to be a good estimate in 2019. We had excellent yields, assuming that 35% of the total nitrogen was available. So I think that's a number that you can use with confidence. Moving on to the 2020 study, I guess before that, so Liz, you still been able to hear me fine?
Yep, all good.
Okay, good. In 2020, we decided to take the study and see whether or not we could reproduce the results that we've got, the slight increase in yield, if there is a slight increase in yield, and a certain increase in crude protein content, basically across different silage varieties. So we repeated the study in 2020, considering different nitrogen application rates, but also in this case, bringing in different corn silage varieties to see whether or not we could reproduce our results. This is the study design. We had 5 corn silage varieties, each from different seed companies, so that we could have the maximum diversity in the seed that we did use. Many of the varieties were based on recommendations from you all. For each of those varieties, we had 3 replicates at 5 different nitrogen application rates. We repeated that in 4 locations, and in each case, we're harvesting 2 rows that are 30 feet long. So we had good replication. We did reproduce that at the same experiment stations that we did, that we used in the first 3 years of the study. This time we left off the 120 and the 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre rates, because it was very difficult to conduct the study with this many varieties. So we took what was most pertinent in terms of the rates that we're considering. And we did repeat at least part of the investigation into these different varieties on a large plot study where we're at 12 rows wide, 6 of which we harvested. And for each of the different replicates, in that case, we had 4 varieties. So we had some very large plot studies to verify the results for this year. In the large plot study, it was a manure study, so we did apply some urea at planting, 45 pounds, that should say nitrogen, not NA, 45 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and we irrigated with wastewater at planting, about 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre. We applied some more urea at V6. I think this is a good strategy. And for us, because we're irrigating with a pivot, we have the convenience of being able to apply wastewater after the crop is up. And we did irrigate it at V6 and again at I say V10 here, but it was probably closer to V8. And so this is another replication of using manure a combination of manure and commercial fertilizer to produce our silage. Not surprisingly, I suppose, we had no differences in the yield across the different varieties that we tested. And for that reason, I've combined all of the yields for each of the different varieties and just assign them to nitrogen application rates. And you can see that, as in the first 3 years of the study, it's hard for us to show that we have a consistent yield increase above 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that's what we've seen here in this graph for M-Track. All of these treatments are not significantly different in terms of the yield. The same was true at Highland Rim, and you can see here the vagaries of just the variability that we get. We did have depressed yields for reasons that we don't really understand at Highland Rim this year at our higher nitrogen application rates, and sometimes that does occur. It's just part of the variability that we get when we do the studies. There is a tremendous amount of variability. But again, at Highland Rim, we had no significant differences in yield across the different varieties that we tested. And again, we had 3 replicates of each variety at each nitrogen application rate. So we had adequate replication. We just simply weren't able to see a significant difference. That was not the case at the Plateau Research Station. We did have slight differences, and here the graph I'm showing the different seed that we used from our different seed companies. And you can see that for the 150 and the 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre rate, we had a significant difference. In this case, the Beck's variety did not yield as well as the other varieties, and that was true for the DeKalb variety here at 150. These are right on the cusp of not being significantly different, I'll say, and we did not see the consistency across all of the nitrogen application rates for these differences in the varieties. So you can see, for example, at 210 and 240 pounds of nitrogen per acre, I'm not showing any letters here because there's simply not differences that are significant. I did combine these results. You're not really supposed to do that when they're statistically significant in terms of the differences, but it does show a repeat of what we observed in the first 3 years of the study, namely that we have this very small increase in yield as we increase our nitrogen application rates above 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So in essence, we're repeating the results that we got in the first 3 years of the study across a number of varieties that we've used in the study. I'm going to talk about this later. Our yield at Little River for the small plot study this year was terrible. We had to plant those plots late, and we had to replant some of it, and we did get southern rust into the plots, and it greatly depressed yield. There was no difference in any of the yields for the different varieties, but obviously you can see from the yield that the yield was severely depressed for those plots for that reason. We did have in yield across the varieties in the large plots that we tested. These only, remember, it's in the nitrogen application rate. Yield differences are 1 to 11 and significantly on the order perhaps 1.5 tons of silage per acre. You still hear me?
It just got a little bit rough there for a second, so I'm not sure if that was an internet thing or what, but you're sounding better now.
Okay. Okay, and this is the crude protein content. You can see that this, again, replicates what we found in the first 3 year study, namely that there's a slight increase in the crude protein content as our nitrogen application rate increases. This is a good finding. It gives more credence to the changes that we're going to be making to the nitrogen application rates, I believe. Again, a slight increase, but no significant difference. You have to accumulate a number of site locations and site test years before this difference that you see here, the small difference, is statistically significant. Again, these are the results of crude protein content across variety. I'm not showing the individual varieties because they didn't vary. A slight increase in crude protein content on the order of what we predict, graph that I showed earlier that shows the slope of the line. The take-home message: variety had a low impact on yield and the crude protein content of silage. The yield and silage effects we observed in the first 3 years of the study are really confirmed across all of the varieties, namely that there's a small or no increase in any given year in yield if we use more than 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. However, we can expect a consistent increase in the silage crude protein content, somewhere on the order of, in terms of yield, 80 pounds of crude protein an acre for an extra 30 pounds of nitrogen that we apply. The P and K removal rates, I simply don't have time to show those results, but in all of these studies, including this past year's studies, the P and K removal rates are higher than our current MMP estimates, again confirming that our new estimates are accurate. I want to go just for a few minutes into a little more in depth in terms of the rust that set in on the Little River plots, both the small plots and the big plots, and also at Plateau. This is a photograph. It got pretty bad, especially in the small plots. It looked to me like perhaps even a combination of southern rust and common rust, but I think it was dominated by southern rust. We decided to see whether or not we could tell a difference between the varieties based on a scoring system that we put in place, just to see whether or not, in fact, there was some resistance. At Little River, we had 3 scores. So for both the small plots and the big plots, we used a scale of 1 to 5 because the severity of the rust there was a good bit worse. So we rated visually the impact of the rust on a 1 to 5 scale, and at PREC we repeated that on a 1 to 3 scale, simply because there the effects of the rust were more moderate, just to see whether or not we could see if there's differences in resistance across the varieties. And in fact, we did see that there were clear differences between the varieties in terms of the rust resistance. So a higher score here on this side of the axis means that it's the variety is more affected. You can clearly see that for the small plots, which were severely affected with rust, the Augusta variety did appear to be less affected by the rust. That was these findings were largely repeated for the large plot study. The Augusta seemed to perform a little better than some of the other varieties. However, these results were not entirely repeated at Plateau. There, the Augusta did perform a little better than a couple of the other varieties. But I guess what we wanted to answer is, whether or not this difference that we could see visually in the resistance to the rust, whether or not that actually had any impact. And that was one of the interesting findings, is that our severity scores for the rust ratings did not correlate with the silage yield or the silage quality. So we didn't see a clear link between the relative severity of the rust and yield or quality. No question that the rust did contribute to lower yields at Little River, particularly in the small plots. It does appear that we may have some differences between varieties in resistance across locations. So I thought that we did our best to really see if we could learn something from this. There are clear differences in susceptibility, but it's not clear to me that that translates into real differences in terms of yield and quality impacts. I think the take-home message from this is obvious. You need to plant the corn silage as early as you can. Now, that's not always possible. If you're double cropping in certain circumstances, you're going to have to plant late, or in some cases you may have to replant because of damage. In those years, if we are experiencing hot and humid weather, you can expect that southern rust at some point in the season is going to be a problem. So far as we can tell, the resistance won't dramatically reduce the yield, but it might be something that you would consider, that you would try to purchase seed that may be purported to offer resistance to southern rust if you know that you're going to be planting late. Frankly, I don't think it's a concern if you're planting in April or even in early May. And obviously, one thing that we learned is that you should consider harvesting early. I believe that if the impact is severe, if only to avoid the problems associated with low moisture content in the silage that is harvested, I believe that you should harvest it early if you can see that the impact is going to be severe. So that's it. I have no idea how I did on time. For some reason, I don't have my phone here, so hopefully I didn't run over. I know a couple of people had questions. I've seen some hands raised, so I guess, Liz, if you can help me moderate, then perhaps I can answer some questions at this point.
Absolutely. So 1 second, and Blake, I'll give you permission to talk and you can ask your question. So Blake, you should be able to unmute if you have a question. Anybody else, feel free to raise your hand or throw any questions in the Q&A box. Do we have any questions from the room? Yes, Steve.
Liz, Steve Harrison here, Sean, if you can hear me.
Yes, sir, I can.
Okay, so we're seeing rough results. There's 3/4 of a ton increase in yield for every 30 units of nitrogen up to that 240.
That's correct.
Okay, roughly those 30 units of nitrogen are going to cost $13, and you're going to get a return of about $40 or $37 with last year's silage prices. So a $13 investment for a $40 return sounds pretty good to me. And
It's there, I believe, yes. Yeah, we discussed this last year, and we really see it again this year across the varieties. I don't think there's any question that even not considering the more consistent change that we see, which is significantly different, and that is the crude protein content, it appears to me that we can justify increasing our nitrogen application rates and matching our recommendations for grain. Obviously, I don't do that by myself. I'll have to take the very carefully accumulated data. I've worked very hard on this project to accumulate this data, frankly, because we know that this is going to affect manure application rates. And so we don't want to be questioned about the recommendation to increase, right? So I'm going to be taking this to the committee that UT Extension has for our fertilizer recommendations. It's going to be my recommendation based on exactly what you just described, that we increase our nitrogen application rate recommendations for silage.
Thanks, Sean. Blake, go ahead with your question. Maybe.
Dr. Hawkins,
Yes.
this blight, you really saw it in Middle Tennessee very severely too. Fungicides, have there been any studies done on fungicides showing that they help in the impact of this on corn? Do you know any data on that?
It does work, but you have to make certain that you're applying the correct fungicide. So it's important that we learn the difference between southern rust, which is more commonly a problem here in Tennessee than common rust. You have to get the correct fungicide. They do work. I guess in talking to a few producers this year, it appears to me that unless the rust problem is severe, I can't see that because it's going to tend to occur later in the growing season. I can't see that in most years that we can expect that it's going to have an impact on yield or silage quality. But in those years when we do have an impact, I do think that it would be good to have a crop consultant or someone with the extension to come and help diagnose the rust and as quickly as possible get a fungicide applied, because it will help. The best thing to do is to plant early, because the way that the rust works is it doesn't overwinter here. We get influxes of the spores from southern latitudes, and that takes time for the rust to sporulate and make its way to Tennessee. So the earlier that we plant in the season, the more protection that we have against rust. But I'll have to say that at Little River this year, it was really bad. There was just a cloud of red dust when we harvested the small plots. And in that case, obviously, it is, we would have been better off trying to treat it.
Looks like we have a question in the Q&A. Sean, can you read that, or do you need me to read it to you?
Let's see here if I can.
I'll just read it. Does soil quality, looking at CEC, affect the nitrogen availability for the plant? Would it contribute to the low difference between the higher nitrogen applications?
I think what contributes most is that we have a warm and humid climate. So I think what's predominant and why we don't do nitrogen soil testing in Tennessee is because it's very difficult for us to measure nitrogen and make sense out of the results when we, in terms of our nitrogen application rates, for our various crops. And that's why we make our recommendations based on yield. So I guess my answer to that would be that, that's going to depend on any given year. And for example, how much rainfall we get and the temperature that we experience after the nitrogen application. I think those are much more important factors, frankly, than something like CEC.
Thanks, Sean. Any more questions from the room? Or via chat? Or Q&A, sorry.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it.
That means no.
Welcome, Stan.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate your time.
I look forward to seeing everybody again soon.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.